Welcome back. Today I'm going to start to talk about the second of the seasons of the year addressed in Waka, and, not entirely coincidentally, the one we're in now, winter. I'm going to follow the same pattern as I did in my earlier video on autumn, and group the various winter topics and images under the general headings of the season, weather and celestial phenomena, topography, lifestyle, ceremonies, animals, and plants. As was the case with autumn, not all of these categories are equally important, or have as many topics or images associated with them, so some of them will take more time than others to go through. In fact, in this video, I'm only going to cover the season, weather and celestial phenomena, as I found myself going into quite a bit of detail on these aspects of Waka's winter when I got thinking about them. I hope you enjoy going through winter with me as much as I did thinking about the poems. So let's get started with the season of winter and the poems associated with it. Waka on the season in general mainly focus on where winter falls in the calendrical year and what that means, although there's a subset of poems simply containing variations on the phrase when it is winter, fuyu sareba, which sets the context for other statements about the conditions. A representative example of this type of poem is from a folding screen in the residence of Lord Kotoku. Fuyu sareba arashi no koe mo takasago no matsu ni tsukete zo kukube karikeru. When it is winter, the storm winds howling through Takasago's pines is what I hear. As the headnote reveals, this poem was composed for a folding screen, byobu, and would have accompanied a painting as part of the decorations for an aristocratic dwelling. Given the poem's contents, there's little doubt that this would have pictured pine trees. Takasago is what's known as an utamakura, literally a poem pillow, a poetically significant place name. Takasago lay on the inland seacoast, approximately 30 kilometres to the west of Kobe, and is mentioned in 3 poems in Kokinshu, 2 of which also mention pine trees, something which firmly established the link between the location and the plant in later poems like this one here. Getting back to poems on the season, the main focus is on winter's position at the end of the year, with analogies drawn with the end of the day, starting with evening. The phrase used in these types of poems was toshi no kure, the evening of the year, as in this one. A poem from a poetry contest held by Her Majesty the Empress in the Kampyo period. Yuki furite toshi no kure nuru toki ni koso tsui ni momijinu matsu mo mie kere. Snow falls and the year reaches its evening. It is at this time that truly evergreen the pine tree seems. This type of usage was remarkably consistent throughout the Hachidaishu period, that is, that covered by the first 8 imperial poetry anthologies, lasting from the early 10th to the early 13th centuries. In Shinkokinshu, the 8th anthology, which was officially presented in 1205, there are a number of great poems on this theme. Sent to someone at the evening of the year. Onozu kara iwa no shita o hitoyaru to yasura o hodo ni toshi no kure nuru. I said nothing, but fondly do you think of me, and while I wondered, the year has reached its evening. This waka is considered one of Saigyo's most representative poems, with its delicate expression of the uncertainty of affection. His speaker has finally plucked up the courage to say something, but suspects that it is too late. Just as the year has reached its end, so too the time is likely past for him to have done so. This link between the end of the year and regrets over a person's past is a common theme in these Shinkokinshu poems. For example, Shunzei's daughter says, composed on the evening of the year, Hedate yuku yoyo no omokage kaki kurashi yuki ni furinuru toshi no kure kana. Disappearing into the distance are the shapes of times gone by, darkness descending with the falling snow, my age, at the evening of the year. The falling snow suggests the white that old age is bringing to her hair, while furu, fall, is homophonous with furu, be old, adding to the sense that she's talking about her life drawing to a close, along with the year. These emotions are more directly expressed by Izumi Shikibu, whose poem in this sequence is at the evening of the year when she was lamenting that she had grown old. Hazoureba, toshi no nokori mo nakari keri, oinuru bakari kanashiki wa nashi. I count the days, but remnants of this year are none. My age simply brings nothing but sadness. Here, the phrase evening of the year is relegated to the poem's headnote, but we get a strong sense that she's looking ahead to her inevitable death with distaste and frustration. Linked with the evening of the year was another winter theme, the departing year, Yukutoshi. When His Majesty commanded him to submit a poem, he composed this and offered it. Yukutoshi no oshiku mo aru kana, masu kagami, miru kage sae ni kurenu to omoeba. The parting year fills me with regret, for in a clear glass all I see are signs of my own passing. Tsuruyuki's poem captures the frustration of seeing the signs of aging on one's features. 200 years later, the link between regrets and the end of the year was still growing strong, with Ariie composing. Composed on the conception of the evening of the year by the sea at the residence of the Tsuchimikado palace minister. Yuku toshi o ojima no ama no nuregoro mo kasanate sode ni nami ya kakuran. The parting year covers me with regret, as at Ojima the fisherfolk's drenched robes are laid atop each other with sleeves, still washed by waves, it seems. This poem was composed for a poetry contest and utilises a number of techniques to create its effect. Wet sleeves always suggested that they were so because the poet had been weeping, and this is emphasised by the use of nami, waves, which suggests namida, tears. Similarly, the beginning of the place name Ojima, Oji, would have been written identically to the adjective oshi, feel regret, so there's an orthographic evocation of the emotion. In addition, by describing the fisherfolk's clothing as layered, the poem also suggests that the poet's regrets are too. All of these emotions follow the introduction of the parting year at the beginning of the poem, emphasising that these are the correct ones to feel at this time of year. Getting back to the link between the calendar year and the day, the next winter topic is Toshi no Yo, the night of the year. Poems on this topic often focus on the very last night of the year, that is, the last day of the 12th month. In fact, this was a specific topic for composition in Horikawa Hyakushu, the Horikawa 100 poem sequences, dating from 1105-1106. Some representative examples of poems from this are Yoshinogawa nagarete suguru toshinami ni tachi no kage mo kure ni keru kana. The river Yoshino flows past, the year's waves rise and fall, shapes vanish into the twilight. Masafusa cleverly only alludes to the time of the year in this poem, starting with a reference to the Utamakura Yoshino. This location was strongly associated with cherry blossoms and thus spring, but the poem rushes by this reference in the second line with the image of the river and time passing by. This is then reinforced in the centre of the poem with the compound word toshinami, year's waves, or waves of years. Waves rise and fall endlessly, just as years constantly passes by. And this is made explicit in the subsequent line. The final line introduces the image of twilight and thus emphasises the entire meaning of the poem, that just as waves pass by endlessly, so too the days that make up the year. And everything which has made this year up has always been rushing towards this final night and the year's end, and thus will soon be gone, ready for the cycle to begin again. Nanigoto o matsu to wa nashi ni ake kurete, kotoshi mo kyou ni nari ni keru kana. What is there to wait for? Nothing. Dawn, then dusk, and the new year too. Today has come. Kunizani presents a somewhat more positive spin on matters by looking forward to what comes after the last day of the year, the last day of the old year, the new one. I was quite pleased to come across this poem, as it acts as something of an antidote to the heavy burden of regrets and depression which we've had so far, and a characteristic of end-of-the-year poems. 言霊のおぶつかなさにおかみすと、梢据えても年を越すかな。The mystery of words leaves me uncertain. Viewing the land from yonder hilltop, even the firmly planted treetops pass through the air. Shunrai was considered something of an eccentric by his contemporaries, and this poem is no exception. It's one of those that takes careful consideration before you can work out the images the poet is conveying, and it's difficult to translate due to the dense vocabulary choices. He starts with the word kotodama, which I've translated as mystery of words, although it's really more than that. It's the inherent mystical power inherent in certain phrases to influence the world, and more than the world, too. It makes for a somewhat portentous and archaic beginning to the poem, but Shunrai immediately undercuts this by stating that this strange linguistic force is vague and difficult to understand. It is, of course, but it's somewhat bad taste to admit it so bluntly. He then follows this with another portentous term, okami. Literally, this means seeing from on top of a hill, but in fact, this was a ritual conducted by early emperors. By climbing to high vantage points and surveying their domains, they laid ritual claim to everything which was in their field of view. The situation here is complicated by the fact that the act of doing this, looking from a hilltop, is marked with a particle, to, which indicates that this is a quoted thought, and this could also apply to the beginning of the poem. I thought I'd follow in the footsteps of ancient emperors and view the land, but how difficult it is for me to understand the mystical power of language. What does our poet see from his hillside, though? Well, the treetops, not really surprising in heavily forested pre-modern Japan. The trees have been there for ages, that's why they're firmly rooted, but he reflects, even for them, this year has passed. So at the end of the poem, you have something physical and tangible, the trees, and something intangible and conceptual, the passage of time as measured in years. Something which, one might say, can only be described and understood with words, and the power of words. Thus, despite his pose of lack of comprehension at the beginning of the poem, by its end, Shunrai shows he understands only too well. As well as the last night of the year, another winter theme was Winter's Nights, Fuyu no Yo. These poems tended to be less intellectual than those on the end of the year, and instead describe what a winter's night was like. For example, topic unknown. 思いつつ寝なくにあくる冬の夜の外の氷は溶けずもあるかな。Filled with passionate thoughts, sleepless until dawn, on a winter's night, the ice upon my sleeves shows no sign of melting. This poem conveys a study in contrasts between the icy chill of winter, which has frozen the tears upon the poet's sleeves, and the heat of her passion. Winter nights were, of course, long, and so the reference serves to emphasise the length of time she's been up and weeping. Like some of the autumn poems we looked at in the last video, this could almost be a love poem. Topic unknown. 思いかね、芋狩り行けば、冬の夜の川風寒み、千鳥なくなり。Unable to bear this love, I set out for my darling, on a winter's night, when the chill wind from off the river carries the plover's cries. This poem by Tsurayuki continues the same theme of contrasting the poet's passion with the chill of the winter's night. As well as emphasising the cold of the wind, he also brings in one of the birds most associated with winter, the plover, chidori, for an additional seasonal reference. From among his winter poems, Fuyu no yo no nagaki yo okuru sode nurenu, Akatsuhi gata no yomo no arashi ni. Throughout this winter's night I lie awake with soaking sleeves. Toward the dawn on all sides I am amidst the storm. Gotoba also emphasises the length of the winter's night, but also brings in another meteorological feature of winter, storms. The storm raging outside his palace is, of course, mirrored by the storm of emotions that have kept him awake and weeping all night. The implication is that it is love which is causing his suffering, but knowing his fate, ending his life in exile after an unsuccessful rebellion against the samurai government, it could equally well be his frustrated ambition. From what we've seen so far, it should be clear, I hope, that the main sensation associated with winter in Waka was cold or chill, and we see this expressed and described in any number of poems, even those which were not formally classified as winter poems. For example, a poem composed at a competition held by Her Majesty the Empress during the Kampyo era. Sasa no ha ni okushimo yorimo hitori nuru waga koromo de zo sayabasari keru. On bamboo grass leaves settles frost, but sleeping alone my sleeves are colder still by far. This is formally a love poem, but Tomonori uses a winter image to convey his speaker's desolation. Left alone, the coldness is even greater than that of the frost settling on the leaves outside. Composed when he presented a 100-poem sequence during the reign of former Emperor Horikawa. Kogarashi no kumo no fukihara o takane yori saete mo tsuki no sumi noboru kana. The biting wind blows the clouds from off the high peaks. 'Tis cold, but the moon climbs clear. This was formally classified as an autumn poem, but Shunrai begins it with a reference to kogarashi, a wind most strongly associated with winter, and follows this up with a reference to the wind's chill, so it has a strong flavour of wintry elements. In a 100-poem sequence, Samushiro no yowa no koromo de sae saete hatsuyuki shiroshi oka no be no matsu. Alone in my meagre bedding, my nightgown sleeves are deeply chill indeed. The first snows lie white upon the pines along the hillside. Shokushi starts her poem with a reference to a samushiro, which was a woven straw mat used for bedding. A princess would have had something more comfortable to sleep on, I think, so she's using a bit of poetic license in her description. But in any case, the main reason for using the word samushiro is that the initial syllables, samushi, were homophonous with the adjective meaning be cold. So Shokushi starts her poem emphasising the coldness of her situation, and thus positions the poem as a winter one, something she reinforces with the later reference to snow, as well as the central sae saete, which I've translated as deeply chill. In the original, Shokushi uses repetition, sae sae, chill chill, to create this effect. Finally, in this section, there was one other theme for winter poems, which was as harbingers of spring. This might seem a bit strange, but just as summer poems could look forward to autumn, and autumn poems, as we saw in the last video, could look back to summer and ahead to winter too, so winter waka could anticipate the coming of spring. For example, composed on the falling snow. Fuyu nagara sora yori hana no chiri kuru wa kumo no anata wa haru ni aru ramu. It's winter now, yet from the skies blossom comes fluttering down. Beyond the clouds, can it be spring already? Fukayabu sets his poem clearly in winter with the explicit mention of the season, but anticipates a typical spring-like scene by wondering if the falling snow is blossom. This sort of elegant confusion is one of the hallmarks of Kokinshu poetry, and something Waka adopted from the tropes of Tang Chinese poems. This type of theme was one of which Fukayabu was fond, because he has another similar poem later in the anthology. On the day when the following day would mark the beginning of spring, he saw the snow being blown by the wind from the house next door, so he composed this and sent it over. 冬ながら春の隣の近ければ、長きよりぞ花は散りける. 'Tis winter, yet spring as a neighbour lies close, so from the fence between, blossom has scattered. Here, with spring due to begin officially the following day, he's imagining the snow being blown off the fence between his and his neighbour's house, his blossom, being blown ahead of the approaching season. One further final example. Topic unknown. Itsushika to yama no sakura mo waga gotoku toshi no kanata ni haru wo matsu ran. Eagerly, the mountain cherries, just as I, on this side of the year's end, seem to await the springtime. Here, the anonymous poet projects her own feelings of longing for spring onto the trees she can see in the mountains. The celestial object most strongly associated with winter was, in fact, the moon. So there's a distinct subset of winter moon poems, most of which focus on the season of winter by emphasizing the coldness of the scene described. For example, topic unknown. 大空の月の光し清ければ、影見し水ぞまず凍りける. From the firmament, the moonlight is so pure, the waters touched by its beams are the first to freeze. Here, the poet suggests the winter moonlight is so cold that as it passes across the pond in his garden, it freezes the water. It gives an evocative, almost unearthly air to the scene, I think. Topic unknown. むべたまの夜のみふれる白雪は照る月影の積もるなりけり. Lily-seed dark the night, where fallen snow so white shines with the moonlight drifting, piled high. This poet doesn't mention the cold explicitly, but it's implied in the reference to snow. Again, chill and sterile purity being described with the bright moonlight, emphasizing and reinforcing the whiteness of the snow which has fallen. Composed gazing at the moon. Amanohara, sora sae sae ya wataru ran, kori to miyuru fuyu no yo no tsuki. The plain of heaven, the sky, so coldly does it seem to cross, ice it does appear, the moon upon a winter's night. Aegyo comes right out and says that on a winter's night, the moon might as well be a lump of ice passing through the sky. Again, though, we see the emphasis on the winter moon being a symbol of cold and chill. Winter moonlight at a mountain retreat. Yama oroshi no keshiki bakari ya fuyu naramu, miyako nariseba aki no yo no tsuki. The wind howling down the mountain simply sets a scene of seeming winter, but, were I in the capital, an autumn night's moon would this be. Finally, by way of contrast, Yoshitsune returns to the moon's beauty. The season is winter, a gale is blowing, and he's at a mountain temple for religious reasons. Nevertheless, the moon is still beautiful, so much so that he could almost think the season is autumn as he looks upon it. This waka demonstrates the contrast in approaches to the moon between autumn and winter poems, with the focus being on beauty in the former and inclement weather and the cold in the latter. The next weather-related phenomenon in winter poems is the wind, more specifically the kogarashi. Literally, this word means tree, ko, and withering, garashi, and referred to the cold and biting winds that blew in late autumn and winter. As a result, you'll find it used in both late autumn and winter waka, but in the former, it's generally symbolic of the change of the season and an indication that winter is on its way. The association with winter grew stronger as waka developed until it became a piece of diction almost exclusively used in poems on that season in the early modern period when haikai and hokku were being composed. You can get a good sense of its meaning and associations, though, from this early waka. on the cold wind. Kogarashi no oto wa sugi ni shi, toki naredo, toki wa nitsune ni matsu ni fuku kaze. The biting wind's howl has passed, and yet the evergreens always pine for the gusting breeze. The reference to evergreens and the wordplay over pine matsu serves to emphasize that by the time the kogarashi blows, all the deciduous leaves will have been stripped from the trees, and thus the season must be winter. A later example of a winter poem using the term would be Shii shibai wa fuyu koso hito ni shirare kere, koto to warare no kosu kogarashi. The brushwood that 'tis winter to folk does tell, hail-raising cries from the leaves left by the freezing winds. Here, Taker loads his poem with winter-related diction, including an explicit mention of the season, a reference to hail, arare, and of course the use of kogarashi to end the poem. In the competition, the participants criticise this ending for being overly fierce, although the judge disagrees and says it's perfectly pleasant. This association with fierceness was another element of the meaning of kogarashi, though, and meant the expression was sometimes used in waka on topics other than winter to convey that sense. For example, see the following exchange of poems from Gosenshu. Although he had expressed his feelings to a woman who had another man in her thoughts, when she was cold to him, he sent her this. Omou hito, omowanu hito no, omou hito, omowazaran, omoishiru beku. There is one I love, who does not love me, but loves another. I wish that she did not. That is what I would have you know. In reply, Kogarashi no mori no shitagusa kaze hayami, hito no nageki wa oisoi ni keri. The biting wind upon the forest's undergrowth blows fast. The trees of grief have grown ever taller. Now, whatever one thinks of the morality of a man attempting to seduce a woman whom he knows is in love with someone else, her response, using the metaphor of the kogarashi blowing through the forest, is cutting. Your claims of love, the kogarashi, for me, the undergrowth, she says, are too much, and all they do is cause us greater suffering, you from unrequited love, and me for having to put up with them. Basically, she's telling him to get over himself and get lost, but in an elegantly poetic way. To round off this consideration of kogarashi, let's look at a couple of examples of its use in autumn poems to show how it looked forward to the change of season. Composed on the conception of the autumn wind at a mountain retreat. Yamazato no shizu no matsugaki hima o arami, itaku na fukiso kogarashi no kaze. Around this mountain dwelling, the peasant's pinewood fence has gaps aplenty. Blow not so hard, O biting wind. Reading this, one can really feel Echizen shivering away as the kogarashi whistles through the cracks in the crude fence around where she's staying. At least I can. This is definitely not early autumn, and so winter must be on the way. Topic unknown. Ogi no hani, tsuyu fuki musubu kogarashi no otozo yosamu ni narimasaru naru. Silvergrass fronds blown with tangling dewdrops, the biting wind's howl, night's chill does make the stronger. Here, again, one can see the association between the kogarashi and the cold. In fact, this poem contains a further indication that this is late autumn, with the use of yosamu, which I've translated here as night's chill, as this expression was only used about a cold that one felt at night at that time of year. The next piece of winter weather is rain. This topic isn't nearly as substantial as some of the other meteorological phenomena used in winter waka, but I'm including it here as it acts as a bridge to some of the others which I'll talk about in a moment. From among the poems he composed daily in Bunei 7, 1270. Fuyu no ame no nagori no kiri wa Akesugite, kumoranu sora ni nokoru tsuki kage. The winter rain's remnants of mist have cleared away, and in the cloudless sky lingers moonlight. You can see the focus in Tamei's poem is not the rain itself, but its after effects. It's fallen, but only briefly, leaving the sky clear for the moon in the sky. This type of poem reflects the somewhat brief way in which rain fell in winter, soon to be overtaken by snow, as we'll see in the next poem. On Winter Rain, from a 100-poem sequence on the Four Seasons, composed in Jōkyū 2, 1220. Miyakobito chigirishi mono o hatsuyuki ni matsu no ha o shiki yuguri no ame. Yugure no ame. Capital folk did make a vow, upon the first snows pine needles spread by the evening rain. My impression here is that Ietaka is not talking about actual pine needles being scattered about. Instead, what he's referring to is the way that snow looks after a brief fall of rain, with lots of narrow dark marks upon it. This poem emphasises the almost supplementary nature of rain in winter, something which might fall after snow, but which would leave no more than a few brief dints upon it. I'm sure you've realised from the above that one of the most important seasonal weather phenomena for Waka was snow, but before I get onto that, I want to talk about some other types of precipitation as a way of building up to it. So, before snow, there is hail, arare. This was associated with winter from the earliest times, appearing in manual poems, such as a poem composed by Prince Naga on the occasion of a visit to the Naniwa Palace in Kyoun 3, 707. Arare utsu, arare matsubara, sumiyoshi no, otoyotome to mirudo wa kanu kamo. Hail strikes, arare matsubara, in Sumiyoshi, a pleasure girl I see, yet cannot get my fill. Although this isn't a winter poem as such, Prince Naga uses the image of a sudden fall of hail to capture the way in which the sight of the beautiful pleasure girl has struck him with intense longing. In many ways, this is equivalent to our use of lightning in our own poetry, perhaps. Of course, Naga has an additional reason to refer to hail here, as it's incorporated into the place name, Arare Matsubara, and so using it reinforces the impact of the poem. A miscellaneous winter poem. Waga sode ni arare tabashiru maki kakushi kedazute aramu imo ga mimu tame. Upon my sleeves the hailstones strike. I'll wrap them and hide them away, that they not melt, and show them to my darling. This is actually quite a sweet poem, I think. Rather than focus on the sudden and destructive nature of hail, although this is indicated at the beginning, instead, the poet wants to gather the pearl-like hailstones and stop them from melting until he's shown them to his lover. Moving forward to the Kokinshu period, we have a utensil bearer's poem. Miyame ni wa arare furu rashi, toyama naru masaki no kazura irozuki ni keri. Upon the sacred mountain hail has fallen, it seems, for on the distant slopes the evergreen kazura trees have changed their hues. While this poem is formally classified as one by someone who bore utensils used during sacred rituals, the reference to a fall of hail, which has been so severe that even evergreens have lost their colour, clearly situates the poetic context in winter. For a standard winter usage, there is topic unknown. Kakikurashi arare furishike shiratama o shikeru ni wa tomo shito no miru beku. All turns dark as hail falls around, pearls strewn over the grounds where folk can gaze upon them. As you can see in this poem utilises a number of the tropes about hail we have seen in the others. Its sudden nature, the way it can change the appearance of a scene, and the precious and beautiful appearance of the hailstones on the ground. Less savage than hail, but still precipitation from the sky, was mizore, sleet. This too was a frequent topic of winter. Fuyu samumi, kaze mo tomaranu, yamazato ni, itodo mizore zo, furi masari keru. How cold the winter with unending wind around my mountain home, where the sleet ever stronger falls. In this poem, Higo links sleet explicitly with the season and a sensation of coldness. The gradually intensifying fall of the sleet is a symbol of the gradually intensifying depths of the winter itself. Mizore furi, kumoreru fuyu no, harezu nomi, tsukisenu mono ya, maro ga mi no usa. Sleet falling in a cloud-filled winter which never clears, with no one near, how desolate I am. Similarly, Yoshitada explicitly links sleet and winter, but this time it's the way it can cover the sky and intensify the depression that the season can bring. Travel was obviously more difficult during winter in pre-modern Japan, and so it would not be unusual for someone to receive fewer or no visitors at that time of year. Yoshitada's poem expresses that rueful sense of isolation. Utsu no yama, yu koe kureba, mizore furi, sode hoshi kanetsu, aware kono tabi. Gloomy in the Utsu mountains, crossing them at dusk, in a fall of sleet, I cannot dry my sleeves on this lonely journey. Kenshaw similarly links the depression of winter with sleet falling, although in this poem, he intensifies this linkage with the use of an utamakura, the Utsu mountains, Utsu no yama, where Utsu was homophonous with the word meaning depression. In fact, the judge in the contest takes him to task for this usage, saying that there were no clear associations between the Utsu mountains and sleet in earlier poems, and that there were any other number of other places which he could have mentioned which had stronger links between themselves and the weather. Although this, of course, wouldn't have enabled him to bring in the suggestion of the gloominess which Utsu mountains does. A further form of precipitation that was a fertile resource for Waka was frost, shimo. This was frequently used in seasonal poems on both late autumn and winter, but also figuratively in laments and love poems. In these types of waka, frost often suggested old age, with white frost falling on a poet's black hair being a symbol of aging. Alternatively, it could suggest solitude and loneliness. There's many a poet lamenting a frosty bed or frosty sleeves. In seasonal poetry, frost is mentioned from the very earliest times, although even here, just as with other seasonal poems, there's a blurred line between works describing seasonal scenes and those describing human situations. For example, a representative manual poem of this type is On Frost. Hanaharan mo, yofukute na yuki, michi no be no, yusasa no ue ni shimo no furu yo wo. It's so deep at night, don't go. Along your path, atop the bamboo grass, frost has formed tonight. This poem is replete with possibilities. Why is the poet pleading for someone not to leave? Who are they? There's no definitive answer, but a likely interpretation that this is a lady asking her lover not to leave her, as etiquette demanded, before dawn due to the heavy frostfall. The poet plays with words as the expression used for don't go, na-yuki, contains yuki, which is also the word for snow. So the implication is that the frost has been so heavy, it might as well be snow. A more straightforward seasonal description would be composed as a poem on the beginning of winter. Fuyu kite wa shito yo futa yo tamasasa no hawake no shimo no tokoro seki made. Since winter's coming, in but a single night, or maybe two, upon the bamboo grass leaves the frost has left no gap at all. Here, Taker captures the sudden onset of winter and the change it has wrought on the bamboo grass in his garden. On the moon at dawn during the Kasuga poetry contest. Shiokoru soda ni mo kage wa nokori keri tsuyu yori nareshi ariaki no tsuki. From frost flows and sleeves your glitter arises, accustomed to rising from dewdrops, O daybreak moon. Michitomo links together a series of separate natural phenomena, frost, dew, and the moon, to create a general image of the serene chill appropriate to the beginning of winter. Even so, by referencing sleeves, sode, he's suggesting that the dew is actually the poet's tears, and he has been weeping throughout the night. Composed on the conception of the start of winter, in the poetry contest in 1500 rounds. Okiyakasu, aki no wakare no, sode no tsuyu, shimo koso musube, fuyu ya kinu ran. Still awake at dawn, parting from autumn, the dew upon my sleeves is laced through with frost. Winter has come, perhaps. Shunzei explicitly makes this a poem on the beginning of winter by referencing autumn's departure at the beginning of it and ending it on a tentative quotation. This waka is almost a map as to how emotions develop at the end of something, with dew turning to frost being used figuratively to indicate how grief intensifies. Again, the dew upon his sleeve suggests tears and thus establishes a mood of sadness for the entire poem. The final type of precipitation associated with winter was, as I'm sure you've guessed by now, snow, yuki. Waka on snow, though, tended to be divided into two types addressing different parts of the winter season. There were poems on snow itself, but also poems on the first or early snows, hatsuyuki, with these, just like the ones on frost, occurring from the very earliest poetic periods. One of two poems composed when he joined a banquet held at the residence of Junior Secretary of the Ministry of Ceremonial, Otomo Sukune Ikenushi, on the 23rd day. Hatsuyuki wa chie ni furishike koishiku no okaru ware wa mitsutsu shinowamu. O early snows, fall 1,000-fold, for love lies heavy upon me, and gazing on you, I will remember her. Imaki links the first fall of snow with his feelings of love. Unlike in many waka, he's urging more snow to fall as a way of emphasising the intensity of his affection. The more snow falls, the deeper his love. When he had not come to call for a very long time, she said this on a morning when a little snow had fallen, around the 10th month. Mi o tsumeba aware tozo omou hatsuyuki no furinuru koto mo tare ni iwamashi. When I pinch myself, I realise how pitiful I am. Even the first snows fall. Who is there that I would tell? The old Japanese believed that if you were in a relationship with someone and pinched yourself, they would feel the pain too. So mentioning this in a poem was a way of indicating that you had deep feelings for someone. In this case, however, the beauty of the first snowfall, something which one would want to share with a lover, is something which Ukon has no choice but to keep to herself, for her lover seems to have abandoned her. While this waka is formally a love poem, it's a good example of how early snow was characterised as something beautiful and worth sharing, even if that's not what poor Ukon is able to do. By contrast, the first snows could also be emblematic of sadness. On the day of the first snowfall, when she had much on her mind. Fureba kaku usa no mi masaru yo shirade aretaru niwa ni tsumoru hatsuyuki. As I age, you fall, the excessive grief within this world unknown to you, and upon my desolate garden drifting, oh, first snowflakes. In this poem, Murasaki uses a technique known as honkadori, literally taking from an original poem, but which is usually translated as elusive variation. When a poet does this, he or she takes a line from an earlier poem and incorporates it into their own as a way of adding additional meaning and imagery to their work. In this case, Murasaki's second line, Usa no mi masaru, is borrowed from Topic Unknown. Yoni fureba usa koso masare, miyoshi no iwa no kakemichi, fumi narashitemu. Living in this world brings only an excess of grief. Upon fair Yoshino's steep and rocky trails would I set my feet. This poem implies that the poet wishes to end their suffering by withdrawing to a temple in the Yoshino Mountains. Murasaki echoes this desire as well as intensifying the sense of her suffering through reference to the source poem. However, by referring to the snow beginning to fall on her garden, which is possibly a metaphor for encroaching old age, as well as something which is likely to isolate her and prevent her from moving around, she's also implying that, unlike the previous poet, she will not be able to seek salvation, but will be stuck in the world and must endure her suffering. First snows, however, could also be linked with other types of human activity. Composed on early snow for a palace poetry contest in Eisho 4, 1049. Miyako ni mo hatsuyuki fureba onoyama no maki no sumigama takimasaru ran. In the capital too, when the first snow falls, among Onoyama's evergreens, the charcoal kilns seem to smoulder more and more. Sagami's emphasis here is on what the first snow means for people in terms of the season. The primary means for heating aristocratic dwellings was burning charcoal in braziers. There are any number of accounts of nobles hugging these to themselves to keep warm. So once the first snow fell and the temperature turned much colder, charcoal would have been in much greater demand, hence why the makers are burning their kilns more. Moving on to snow proper, this was referenced extensively in both winter and early spring waka, particularly when poets were adopting a pose of elegant confusion and pretending not to know whether it was snow or blossom on a tree's branches. More straightforwardly, in Manyoshu, snow was treated in much the same way as other types of precipitation and linked with human emotions, as in on snow. Sasa no ha ni hadare furioi, kenaba kamo wasuremu to ieba mashite omohoyu. On the leaves of bamboo grass, fluttering snow covers all, yet when it melts, will you forget, you ask me? So I think on you all the more. By the 10th century and the Kokinshu anthology, snow was firmly established as a seasonal topic, as in topic unknown. Furuyuki wa katsuzo kenu rashi, ashihiki no yama no tagitsuse otomo saru nari. The falling snow must vanish in the moment, like wearying the seasoned mountain rapids, roar grows ever louder. Here, the anonymous poet links snow with the general wildness and roughness of winter, describing how the falling flakes are swept away and vanish in a mountain stream, which is running faster in that season. Composed watching the snow fall. Yuki furite hito mo kayowanu michi nareya, ato haka mo naku, omoi kiyuramu. The snow drifts down and no folk make their way along the path. Is that me? Leaving no trace and sunk in melancholy. Mitsune brings in another theme, often associated with snow, that of isolation. Snow obviously has the potential to cut people off and prevent visitors, but more often in waka, the implication is that the poet is alone because of some kind of social issue, being unhappy in love or disappointed in life, with the unmarked snow along the path of their house symbolic of the lack of interest that society has in them. This means there's often an undertone of frustration in snow poems, although it's rarely explicitly expressed. With that being said, a clever poet could turn Snow's sense of isolation to his advantage, as in, when he had just started talking with a woman, difficulties arose and he became unable to visit her. So he sent her this poem. Kakara demo ari nishimono wo shirayuki no hitohi mo fureba masaru waga koi. If it be so, then so be it, I thought once, but as white snow falling with the passing days, my yearning grows ever stronger. The unspecified difficulties which prevented Narihira from visiting his lady friend might have been weather-related, but are more likely to be objections to his courtship from her family. In any case, he suggests to her that he is unable to approach her, and that, isolated from her by the snow, its increasing height represents the increase in his love for her. Another great poet, Izumi Shikibu, manages to combine an expression of the beauties of the season with an element of human emotion in this waka. Topic unknown. Matsu hito no ima mo kitaraba ikagasemu fumamaku oshiki ni wa no yuki kana. The one I'm waiting for. If he should come this moment, what would I do? For I would regret to dint upon my garden snow. A lover's arrival, of course, was supposed to be eagerly awaited, but the beauties of a garden where snow had fallen were meant to be appreciated. Izumi, I think, captures that very human regret that the lady cannot have her cake and eat it, in that her lover's arrival means sacrificing the beauty of the vista before her. Finally, a somewhat later waka, which I think captures the essence of snow quite well. On the sound of snow in the middle of the night. Akeyaranu nezame no toko ni kikoyu nari magaki no take no yuki no shitaore. No hint of dawn yet awakened in my bed, I hear it. Bamboo against the lattice fence, boughs breaking in the snow. I think anyone who's been out in the snow will be aware of the way in which it deadens the sound and how the world sometimes seems hushed by it. That only makes sudden noises seem louder and more unexpected. A fall of snow can also darken the sky and thus delay the dawn. Norikane's poet is enduring a heavy snowfall indeed, enough to break the bamboo outside his house. By implication, if the snow has been this heavy, he's also likely to have been cut off, and so he's wrapped in solitude, cut off from human company, with only the sounds of the natural world in the darkness to remind him that there's an outside world at all. And if that's not a great expression of winter, I don't know what is. That's it for this video. In the next part, I'll talk about Waka winter topics on topography, lifestyle, ceremonies, animals and plants. Be sure to like and subscribe to this channel if it interests you, and post any questions in the comments. See you soon.